Howdy of you delicious people. So I'm here to talk about finally Tales from the Dark Side, the movie. So I had probably talked about this every once in a while it'll pop up. There have probably been some reviews that probably weren't on this channel right now to the current second of this recording that will probably at some point be here and have at some point me talk about this somewhere. More than likely, if you might like Tales from the Dark Side because of how oddball it is, more than likely you might like the Twilight Zone, the movie, which ultimately kind of has like a bunch of mini stories like this movie does. If anything, going into this movie, I remember just kind of watching late at night, just kind of some old TV, some old movies, and when going into this, I was just godsmacked and baffled by this film. And so recently I was just like, I gotta find a way to get this, and I surefire enough did and watched the entire thing, and I'm like, man, this movie just sticks out like a sore thumb if you can find it. Because these stories in this movie are so odd and so interesting that it's like a car crash and you can't turn away. So there are three stories within this smaller story. We ultimately have a kind of transitional story part going in between every single one of these mini stories to help us very much understand where things are going. So we have something called a wraparound story, which is going to go throughout this entire thing and conclude towards the end of this. We also have a story called Lot 249. We also have a story called Cat from Hell. And we also have a story called Lover's Vow. Very interesting, all of these stories are. Luckily, most of these characters are in within this order, the way of which they appear in the movie. So luckily for me, I won't have to dig through if I want to kind of conclude or mention some actors within this. Luckily enough. Honestly, I think that should always be how it is with an IMDb of like order of appearance of a person, but within a movie. But I think people just don't want to do that kind of like work, to be brutally honest. So here's little snippets of every single one of these stories in a quasi cryptic like sense, because I'm gonna tee them all up, and then eventually we will get to the actual spoiler part where I will talk about them more, hopefully in depthly, or maybe hopefully a little bit more detailed. So, Tales from the Dark Side, the movie, as I have to say the entire thing. So, ultimately we have Debbie Harry, which ultimately, if you've probably know the artist Blondie, you'll probably recognize her at some point within this film. And we have a kid named Timmy, who is Matthew Lawrence, who, if you ever saw Boy Meets World, especially the later seasons, or probably the Rob Schneider movie Hot Chick, you would probably know this guy, Timmy, who plays Timmy in this movie. So we have a kid that is being held captive in a woman's home, and this woman had given him one book to read. And ultimately, the kid did read it and is now going to try in desperation to delay this woman from trying to cook him alive. So justifiably, he is trying to scramble, opening up this Tales from the Dark Side book to halter her from cooking him. So recently, we get within these three stories an interesting journey which comes up. First off, we end up getting a mummy story, which I think was very interesting. Basically, having someone being brought back to the dead via reading a certain piece of paper, like any kind of Evil Dead movie you've ever seen, or this and that along those ways. Ultimately, we also have another story called The Cat from Hell, where ultimately we have a hitman being hired to kill someone, seemingly in a very much uh, elderly home environment. Ultimately, we would naturally have to assume that maybe this hitman is going to be taking a elderly person out. But instead, no, 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 no. We have a hitman who is called upon to murder a cat. Why? Because justifiably this cat is killing a lot of these elderly people in this home, and so reasonably this cat is an unstoppable force taking on a hitman a hitman to fight out this big battle of the nth degree to otherwise have cat versus hitman. Such a obscure like movie, I know, but justifiably I thought it was the weirdest thing that I've ever seen in my life. And so justifiably I went on to here and I was like, wow, this movie, like via this scene, is the weirdest thing I've the weirdest story I've ever heard in my life, with the exclusion of maybe one of the scary movies where they had the cat that is like boxing with the girl, and then eventually like the girl goes down, the cat wins, and he's like, yeah, yeah. This and that are two of the weirdest things, and I wonder if they ever got from one of those scary movies, like maybe they took that from this film, or maybe it was like they've kept using certain kind of cats as a comedic aspect and it continued to work. So now we also have one more story to tell you, called Lover's Vow. So Lover's Vow is an interesting aspect of a guy that justifiably is down on his luck. Down in his luck, he's basically just in desperation to otherwise like justify like coming up with one more painting or one more thing that he can just shove out there to make money, because he has had seemingly painter's block or artist block of sorts. So we have it within this movie that James Remar, who ultimately I know from a lot of movies, which I will bring up and later on, Preston ultimately is pressed between a rock and a hard place, and reasonably, one dark alleyed walking night when he's just walking home after being severely drunk and just having nowhere to go but down, we find out that this guy will have his life changed forever, and or for however long his life lasts. His life will be changed forever by some force of sorts that pretty much makes him realize how close to death he was, and how he should value everything, and eventually he turns his life around, and we will eventually see where this man's journey eventually escalates to, if not eventually goes to seemingly a happy ending until, or maybe, or who knows? Who knows how it goes? Well, I do because I saw the movie, but if you want to check this out, definitely check this out on. I'm gonna have to pause here. Pluto TV. Evidently, that is a place you can watch it for free. I don't know if there's a free trial or anything. There probably is a lot of other places that you can see this movie. You can see it on YouTube. You can see it on Vudu. I knew it was Pluto TV, but I was gonna try to confirm if there was other apps you can in fact watch this at some point in time. So, let's ultimately go into spoiler variation of this movie. I thought that this movie was so weird, but ultimately there might be some either gross out moments or some parts of these stories that ultimately justifiably somebody might not enjoy. But I wouldn't say avoid this movie. When looking at it, I like this 1990 attempt at doing this kind of film. If anything, it seems like at some points, like the puppeteering of one thing kind of like, I don't know if it matched or not. And looking at it, like I don't think it matched. But when looking at this monstrosity that they put together in this movie, I'm like, man, how much work was in that? How much work was putting this monster together, and how much work was putting that effects together? When they had this big monster, but not only that, they had two other monsters as well within this movie. Where I'm like, man, like that was like probably mere like seconds into this film, but how long did it take to like put that all together? Maybe they probably used puppets because, or well, I don't know. Maybe they didn't. Maybe they just hired people and just put like masked them out easily enough. I don't know. But let's go on to spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about the time again you spoil this movie. So going into this now. So spoilers. So we have a woman again in the wraparound story that keeps popping in and transitioning every single one of these stories. A woman seems to come home from seemingly a long day, opens a door up, and you just see this cage at first. Ultimately, you have Debbie that ultimately asks, like, hey, like, did you read the book I gave you? And you just see this book flying and hitting the front of this cage. And so eventually you have it to where Betty is ultimately like doing the math in her head, going, okay, well, per pound, this and that, like I need to definitely throw this thing in the oven by 1:30. And looking at it, there's some time before that. And reasonably, that's when Timmy comes walking into the cage, or walking from out of the darkness to the cage, and I'm like, what are you talking about? And she's like, yeah, I'm gonna cook you at 1:30. I'm gonna cook you. So reasonably, because Betty got him cookies. So reasonably, since she did all this work to get him cookies, and he just threw a book at the cage, well, might as well just cook them. So Timmy starts to like scramble, and because ultimately Betty mentions that the book that she gave Timmy to read was her favorite book growing up. So reasonably, Timmy is now scrambling, saying, "Oh yeah, I did read the book. Believe me, I did read it. Like, I'll even like recant some of the stories that are in this book." And ultimately, Betty's like, "Well, yeah, but like, I'm only interested in a love story." And Timmy's like, "Well, like maybe there's something here. Maybe there's something that I can. Maybe there's one of these stories that kind of feels like a love story." And that's when we start to transition into this very first lot 249. So we ultimately have Bellingham, who procures some Egyptian coffin. Ultimately, we have Bellington, who, as I have to scratch, why my nose scratchy? I don't know. It happens. So Bellingham ultimately takes this coffin and reasonably starts like undoing it, starts looking at it, realizes when he has Andy, who is Christian Slater, come in and open this mummy up. Basically, we realize that this mummy with inside of it had like onions and had all this like dirt and gravel and just gross looking stuff, because this moment, like, you have to where Bellingham basically cuts up this entire mummy, and I'm like, why? Like, doesn't that mummy have a very high value? I'm confused. But Bellingham eventually cuts open this mummy, and I'm like, why? But then eventually realizes that there is some fortune cookie within this mummy, as he pulls out seemingly this scroll. So what ends up happening is Steve Buscemi, who ultimately I've seen in a number of Adam Sandler films, as well as Christian Bale being recently, I've seen him in Mr. Robot, and a number of other things, as well as with that, Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, the Kevin Costner film. So ultimately, we have Bellingham, who ultimately starts reading off of this scroll, trying to figure out what it means. Ultimately, Christian Slater's character Andy is like, "Well, hey, do you know what it means?" And Bellingham is like, "Well, could you read like ancient Egyptian Sanskrit or whatever?" And of course, Christian Slater says no. So it gets to the point to where eventually Bellington eventually can read the Egyptian, and eventually the mummy starts getting out of his own coffin and eventually starts walking around. Eventually the power goes out in the hotel complex. Christian Slater is mentioning to Bellingham that, "Steve, hey man, like, you're the one that has the you're the one that has the God, what is it? The when the power is out, you have the breaker. Yeah, the breaker. The you have the ability of switching the power on and off if reasonably at any point there is a power outage." And sometimes it's just like, well, like one piece fell out, or you needed to flip switches back on and off again. Anyways, so Bellingham is still in his apartment or still in his room. He can't hear, evidently, what Andy is mentioning. So Andy makes his way down to the breaker, to turn the power back on, and reasonably he gets shoved by a mummy for his trouble. Andy didn't really know what it was because it was too dark. So reasonably we have it to where eventually Bellingham finds Andy and they turn the power back on. Eventually we have Susan that is making her way to this place and she is spooked as well. So ultimately Bellingham mentions that it seems to have been that there was some thief, and so reasonably Christian Slater goes out to follow where he thinks the mummy is, but the mummy disappears. Bellingham eventually goes into his place, talks to Susan, kind of talks about what all is stolen. Like, if anything, like, this is very like this movie is kind of a very slow build, but I really like. I think there is a big payoff to this first skit. Like, I think that there is a big, like, interesting, like, okay, well, there's something different about this. There's something unique about it, and that's what I liked. So Christian Slater comes back, realizing that he couldn't find anything, and it seems that Bellingham mentioned something stolen. So reasonably, it seems at some point when the police come and they start looking around, it seems like they realize that the mummy is gone, and that was the thing that was stolen. Eventually, we find out that when Susan goes back home, it seems like there is seemingly some relationship with Susan and Christian Slater's best friend Lee. And so reasonably, because we have Andy and Lee who eventually meets Bellingham, and Lee is kind of the person that kind of treats Bellingham like crap. Ultimately, it seems that Lee like has money to spend, because ultimately, when in the end Bellingham has this crate come in, Lee pays for it with his own money. Because evidently he just has money to blow, even though Bellingham has money as well to pay for this service. So ultimately we have it to where the mummy goes after Susan and goes after Lee. What ends up happening is one thing that I don't quite understand. So when the mummy goes after Susan, she ends up going near the window. And so the mummy ends up cutting her open from behind her, and she is just like, at the window. And we have the mummy who has a bouquet of flowers, because when the mummy shows up into this apartment, what Susan does first is she throws a vase full of flowers at the mummy. He catches it but breaks the vase, but keeps the flowers. And so that's when Susan goes running towards the window, but evidently she didn't run good enough, I guess, to the window to get out of the window. Like, she's just stuck at this window, just going, and that's when the mummy cuts her, and then bizarrely, like, puts a thing of flowers, like, in her back, which makes no sense. Recently, eventually, you just have it to where Christian Slater uh, finds Susan like all seemingly like taped or wrapped up bizarrely, and you can just see that she's dead. Eventually, Lee was killed a little bit earlier, and what had happened to him is that the mummy had gotten an iron coat hanger and taken Lee's brain, or taken a coat hanger and shoved uh, a coat hanger up Lee's nose and did a little brain pulling, and I'm like, oh my god, this is this is so interesting. But then I'm like, and the mummy, like you can just see the mummy like continuously trying to pull out this guy's brain with this iron coat hanger, and I'm like, you can't literally see the gore, but you can like it's the first jab up there, and then you just see the mummy that is like trying to pull this thing out, seemingly of this person's nose, and I'm like, oh my god, this is weird, but it's so awesome. And so what ends up happening is that Christian Slater is mortified that seemingly his best friend and his sister, who is Susan, are dead. And eventually he's trying to figure out who had done it, but the only person he can come up with is Bellingham, because the mummy is gone. So ultimately, Christian Slater eventually goes to Bellingham, Steve Buscemi, and he ultimately goes to his place, ties him to a chair, throws throws Bellingham's thesis papers all around him, and then wants Bellingham to confess for killing his sister and his best friend. Ultimately, Bellingham won't do much of any of this, but Andy is consistently trying to get this information and try to get some answers out of Bellingham. Eventually, we have it to where Bellingham is trying to say the incantation to get the mummy to come back to life to go after Andy, and so he's trying to remember all of the words before Andy, of course, tapes his mouth shut. Eventually, the mummy comes back to life, but it seems that Andy is very much prepared for this. He ultimately has like an exacto knife or electrical knife that seems that he can cut through this mummy, and so reasonably that's what he ends up doing. Reasonably, he ends up, when the mummy starts walking to him, Andy cuts off one of the mummy's legs. The mummy drops, of course, and then so reasonably, Andy snaps off one of the mummy's arms, and the mummy is still continuing to come to Bellingham's aid. It gets to the point where the mummy gets so close, Andy eventually just chops off the top of the mummy's head. And while this is going on, he is tossing parts of this mummy into the fire. And basically, he rips off one of two of the fingers to have as kindling for Bellingham's demise. So it gets to the point to where the Mummy is basically dead, and Andy is asking for the scroll to ultimately Bellingham will have to give him to ultimately realize that he is not going to bring anyone back from the dead or bring seemingly like reconstruct this script and try to reverse engine this script to try to bring others back from the dead. So Christian Slater ends up grabbing this ancient like scroll of sorts and looks at it and starts burning it. And so Bellingham is like, hey, don't burn the script. It's like, if anything, like, that's my life's work ultimately. And he's like, well, I guess you're just gonna have to work on something else. So Bellington begs Andy to keep him alive, and ultimately Andy lets him live. And so reasonably, Bellingham tells Andy, it's like, I'm sorry for whatever I did. You're never going to see me again. And so ultimately, while Bellingham is walking away from this apartment, moving on to parts elsewhere, he is mentioning under his breath, but I will definitely keep in touch, to Andy, from which he cannot hear him. So ultimately we have Bellingham, who is in some cab somewhere laughing it off because ultimately Andy burnt down the wrong script, burnt down the wrong scroll. And he evidently didn't know the difference between the scroll that was towards the mummy and the scroll that was some other kind of scripture. Bellingham told Andy that that one scroll that was with Mummy was only to channel that one mummy. Well, he lied. What he could do was channel seemingly anyone back from the dead. And so while Andy is laughing this all off, when Bellingham is laughing this all off, Andy is going and doing something in his apartment. All of a sudden, he is hearing a knock at the door. Andy answers said knock at the door, and it's both Susan and and Lee that are ultimately at the door, ultimately not saying a word, just that Andy is going to die. So we transition into the next story. Ultimately with Betty ultimately kind of she enjoyed that story, but it wasn't really quite a love story. And so Timmy was just like, well, how about I read you another story? Maybe there's something in here that justifiably you will like. So now we get a cat from hell. So reasonably within this story, we have Halstron, who ultimately gets called to work with Drogon, a seemingly elderly man that lives with two other women, Carolyn and Amanda. And so reasonably what ends up happening is Drogon ends up calling upon this hitman to kill a cat. Because ultimately we have in very flashback forms, Drogon goes into mentioning that this cat, when consistently coming on to this seemingly home of the elderly, it seems like the two other women were wanting to take care of this cat, ending up giving it milk, bizarrely mentioning that this cat was starving even though they were giving him milk. Okay. Starving would, I think, entitle food, but maybe drink and food. I don't know. So we have Carolyn and Amanda who eventually taken off guard by this cat. Recently, we have Amanda. We have Amanda who eventually, while the cat sometime at night was on one step of this flight of stairs, Amanda ends up falling down these flight of stairs because the cat supposedly had tripped her and made her fall down the flight of stairs. Drogon is ultimately never wanted this cat in this house, and he wanted it out of the house, but the two women were just so dead set on this cat being at this house, to where Carolyn eventually, when after hearing the death of her, I guess, friend, ultimately took the cat within her room and secluded herself from Drogon. So what happens is Carolyn eventually, at some point, goes to sleep one night, and the cat ends up latching its body onto Carolyn's head, ending up suffocating her and forcing her to again die. This cat is weird, and it just, I'm so like, what is going on with this cat? So Drogon is hiring Hellstrom, who ultimately is desperate to try to get rid of this cat. And Hellstrom is just like, you've got to be kidding me, right? Like like ultimately at first when Drogon mentions to Hellstrom that his target is right behind him, ultimately when Hal looks behind him, it's just a cat. So Hellstrom thinks he's joking, and Drogon's like, no, 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 like this is the thing that I want you to take out. Ultimately, hey, like, however long this takes you is however long it takes you. If anything, like, we have all kinds of food and beverage and stuff that you will ever need, and reasonably, like, you will like make sure that you kill this thing, you kill it good and dead. Ultimately, bury it and cut off its tail and give it to me, and I'll throw it in the fire and I'll laugh. So we eventually have Drogon, who leaves to go to the city because ultimately he doesn't want this thing to eventually kill him, or like he just wants this job to be done without him being there or be in the line of fire, let's just say. So Halson earlier on eventually just kind of gets his hand scratched by the cat. And so recently his hand bleeds. He has a little bit of a handkerchief of sorts to kind of dab the blood off, which bizarrely doesn't look like he bled at all, but the movie magic. So Drogon leaves, so ultimately we have Halstrom going here. And so reasonably we have Halstrom, who eventually at first like mentions to Drogon, it's like, well, like, what if I just kind of like put my hands on this cat and just easily be done with it? And Drogon's like, it's not gonna work that way. It's not gonna, like, I wish it were that easy, but it's not. Halstrom eventually goes into the kitchen and realizes that this guy has the cheap booze, and opens the fridge and there's nothing really there. It's like, yeah, anything that you'll need, right? What a liar. So, because Drogon knows that basically this hitman won't do the job, or more than likely will probably die. So justifiably, he could lie to his face at any point within here. But Drogon knows that Halston won't believe him at all. So Halston eventually, just like at first, he eventually goes to the refrigerator, and the cat again climbs upon him and starts like scratching him, clawing him, to the point of him realizing shortly thereafterwards that this cat had really cut him very deep, to where he's kind of like touching himself and realizing there's actually blood coming from somewhere. And so recently he ended up like taking off his suit and realizing that, oh my god, there's like, you really got me, cat. Nobody gets me twice. Nobody hits me twice. So reasonably, like, this suit is supposedly like made of like $100 or hundreds of dollars. So reasonably, you have Halstrom that is just like, oh, you have really just ticked me off. So reasonably, we have Halstrom who gets seemingly a needle of sorts, some kind of drug, and tries to go after the cat, tries to run after the cat, and reasonably he's realizing, it's like, man, why am I having to do so much work to try to get this cat? Why am I trying so hard at this? Like, this is silly. Ultimately, at some point, the cat ends up doing any number of things when it comes to this Hellstrom. It ends up where the cat ends up like going for Hellstrom's grapefruits, basically to the point where the cat, with her claws, is basically right in front of this man's pants and starts ripping and clawing right by his huevos, and this guy is in agony. So it just gets to the point to where ultimately Halston ends up, because he is ticked at this point, and he just ends up getting a giant, goofy-looking gun with some red-eyed laser pointer-like thing to shoot at this cat. So ultimately, he notices that the cat is right, sitting on this one part of furniture right next to a TV. So ultimately, he laser sights in on this cat. And he's like, "Goodbye, kitty." And so obviously, this gun was calibrated. This gun was to be the best gun in the world. And so recently, when Hellstrom goes to fire, what ends up happening is that the bullet goes into the TV. And he's like, how did I miss? Like, I had you dead to rights. This makes no sense that I cannot kill you. What is going on here? And so what ends up happening after this is the grossest looking thing that you will probably ever see. Because ultimately, eventually, what happens is Hellstrom ends up um, kind of firing through portions of the house, hitting a grandfather clock. Eventually, the cat ends up on the very top of the grandfather clock. Eventually, the cat jumps from the clock uh, to Hallstrom and ends up going into this man's mouth and ends up to where Hallstrom is choking on this cat, and the cat just keeps going in, just keeps going all the way through this guy's body to where you can just see the stomach just overlapping with supposedly this cat, and Hallstrom is dead. So it's a crazy movie. So Drogon ultimately comes home, and he's like, well, maybe there's some success here. Maybe I don't know. Looks like the hitman is gone. Maybe I don't know. So ultimately, we have it to where Drogon ends up looking at the grandfather clock, and it's like annihilated. But then eventually, he ends up seeing the hitman on the ground, seemingly dead. And Drogon's like, no, no, to the point to where the clock hits noon. You have the cat that comes right back out of said man, and ultimately is making his way to, or its way, because I don't know if it's a girl or guy cat, because why would you make that consensus? And so ultimately, Drogon is eventually getting so scared of this cat, he's desperately clinging on to his medication. And as the cat more and more gets closer to Drogon, eventually I would have to assume that Drogon has a heart attack and dies. Therefore, the cat seemingly at either fear or some other device ends up killing everyone in this story. So the very we also had Gage, who was also in here. That he was one of the four people that were also in this elderly house, and he was also in Breaking Bad, which I almost forgot about. What happened to him is that eventually he ended up like driving around one night, and the cat ended up like scratching him up, ending him to supposedly cause an accident. But when looking at it, they just like circled the camera round and round to make it look like maybe his car flipped over, but it looks super goofy, as if like, why were they flipping the camera around? It looks weird. uh I think I neglected to say that just because of how weird that part of that movie was, and how that made no sense to, I guess, seem like this person is in a car accident. But they could have done an alternative thing. They could have made this look a little bit better, but they weirdly just, like, they could have had a, I guess they couldn't afford a car stunt double in this movie, but you could have maybe done something to find some footage of a car that just flips over. Maybe you could have had the just had the guy die. You didn't have to do really some bizarre camera angles that looked goofy at some point in time. But you know what? It is what it is. So, Lover's Vow. So we have Preston, who is James Remar, who ultimately I know from the movie The Warriors, Dexter, Mortal Kombat 2, because ultimately he wasn't in the first one, because the guy that played Highlander was in the first one. he's been in a ton of stuff. He's been recently on Black Lightning, a whole lot of things. When looking at this guy's resume, All Heroes Must Die. Ultimately, he was also in that as the villain. Yeah, just endless stuff that I could mention here. So we have Preston, who ultimately is an artist down on his luck. It seems like whatever he's trying to do isn't working out. He's getting artist block. Recently, his agent goes to him and mentions, like, hey, like, it seems like you haven't turned any piece of work in, and I don't know how long. So I think I might have to, I think basically you're done. Because reasonably, Preston is like, well, whatever percentage you'll get out of me, will make up for these dry spots. And Preston's agent's like, well, if you're not doing anything, how am I gonna get, I'm just gonna get 0% out of you. If you're doing zero work, I'm gonna get 0%. So I might as well just cut my losses. So Preston is at a bar while hearing this news, and eventually he's getting more and more drunk to the point to where we have the guy that is the bartender ending up trying to help him walk home. All while also it seems that this bartender also has some kind of money purse or something from the day, and ultimately he has a gun as well. So what ends up happening is, while these people are going, are just kind of going about their day, finishing up and making their way home, we eventually have the bartender eventually seem to get attacked by something that we can't quite see. Eventually this bartender ends up getting his hand chopped off, ends up getting raked in the face and all kinds of ugh, and then he falls over to just showcase that he is dead. Eventually we have this giant winged gargoyle-esque monster that appears, and there seems to be a ton of detail being put together within this monster. And Preston eventually is kind of this gargoyle was unbeknownst to him, because while the bartender was getting attacked, Preston was taking a whiz off to the side of the street, because reasonably the bartender mentions well, hey, why didn't you go and go to the bathroom of the bar? And he's like, dude, the alcohol is just running right through me. There's nothing I can do. I have to pee. So as the bartender had gotten taken apart, we have Preston, who eventually notices this monster, this demon, this gargoyle of sorts, and eventually is thrusted upon noticing this demon. And so reasonably the demon makes a deal with Preston, or this gargoyle of sorts makes a deal with Preston, because reasonably Preston says that he please let me live, and I will never tell a soul that I've ever seen you before. And so ultimately we have this this demon-esque monster that is well, you have to promise that you're never going to tell a soul forever that you ever saw me, and you're never gonna show anybody what I look like. You're never gonna show. You're never gonna uh, tell anyone ever anything about this night. And so Preston desperately agrees, and ultimately the demon goes like, "Well, cross your heart," as it scrapes through his chest with the demon's claws, and Preston promises. The demon ends up walking away, and Preston eventually is so mortified by his life being several in the balance that he just barfs as hard as he can, like power barfs as much as he can. Eventually, we have um, Corolla, who ultimately is Ray Don Chong, who ultimately I've seen it kind of every once in a while. I'll kind of see her in things. I think at some point I probably had seen her maybe in like Total Recall, the original one, the Arnold Schwarzenegger one, I believe. I could be wrong about that. Uh, but I know she's been in quite a few things. So I could be wrong. But anyways, we ultimately have Corolla. What an interesting choice name. She ultimately is just kind of walking by casually, like it's a normal night in the city. And Preston eventually grabs Corolla and puts his hand over her mouth and says, I'm not gonna hurt you. I'm not gonna like take advantage of you. Like what are you doing out here?" And Corolla is just like, "Well, like I'm just going about my day." And Preston's like, "You shouldn't be out here. Like it's not safe." And so reasonably bizarrely out of this you have Preston, who is walking Corolla home to be safe, and ultimately Corolla starts asking Preston like what had gotten him so spooked, and ultimately he mentions that he had gotten a fight, uh, had been in a fight in a bar. Ultimately she's like, "Well, hey, how did you get the cuts on your chest?" Ultimately he's like, "Well, like I had a fight with a scotch bottle and I lost." um Reasonably, Preston is very much trying to keep this secret and keep it intact. Preston and Corolla are very much flourishing as a couple. Preston seems to have so much creativity to do paintings over and over. It seems that he is a huge success being a painter. It seems that it seems like Corolla is bringing out the best in Preston. It seems like Corolla is his muse, and ultimately everything is working out to the point where Preston's agent was desperate to try to get back with him, to work with him again. Preston eventually marries Corolla, and like everything is going so well, gangbusters and all that. So it gets to the point where there seems to be 10 years that pass. Eventually, Preston and Corolla get married. Eventually, they have kids together, and everything is going swimmingly. Preston is mentioning how maybe they should buy a house somewhere because everything is going so well. And but it seems that Preston every once in a while seems to be having nightmares, or at some points it seems that Preston seems to be holding out something that Corolla like is seemingly getting closer and closer to, at some points figuring out a little bit here and there, or ultimately it seems like she's getting little pieces of the puzzle at some point. So eventually, 10 years have passed since Preston and Corolla had met, and everything had worked out, and this and that. So Preston eventually, kind of in his head, maybe thinks that maybe the things that he had seen via that one demonic, demon-esque like night maybe was just him being way too drunk, maybe him being way too tossed. And so maybe that promise that he had made, like, was maybe just him, just really very much him just going and being way too drunk. So eventually, at some point, Preston, because everything is going swimmingly for him, he has the girl of his dreams, everything is working out. So he has 2 kids. So Preston goes to Corolla and has this seemingly this private part of his life through this case of sorts. He finally unlocks this case to tell Corolla the truth about the night that he met her, the truth, the previous thing that he had seen. Ultimately showing her a statue, ultimately showing her some photos, some pictures of stuff that looks like this demon. And so reasonably we have it to where Corolla mentions to Preston that he broke his vow, he broke his promise. And so ultimately we have Corolla that is right in front of him starting to do a like an American Werewolf in London transformation. All of a sudden we are starting to see monsterish parts coming out of Corolla. It seems that her entire body is changing all kinds of shape, and Preston is just like, "Oh my God, what are you doing? Stop all of this! Like, change back." And she's like, "I can't." Ultimately, eventually, their 2 kids are kind of in their beds together, kind of concerned about what they are hearing. But eventually, we have Corolla turn into this gargoyle, into this demon, and Preston eventually falls over to then realize that not only his wife is now this demon, but also his kids are demons as well. And he's like, "Oh my God, I'm so sorry that I did any of this. And like, I can't believe that I made this all happen. I'm sorry." So eventually the demon grabs onto Preston, and Preston mentions that he's sorry, that he did this to Corolla and that he loves her. And the demon ultimately mentions, it's like, "Well, I love you too, but you broke your vow." So ultimately she takes a bite out of this guy's neck and kills him. And that is just how this movie eventually, at some points, gets near to its conclusion. So what ends up happening is that we end up having Betty at the end of this movie wanting to cook this kid Timmy. And so what ends up happening is when she unlocks him to get prepared to be cooked, what happens instead is Timmy ends up shoving her in the oven to be cooked as well instead. So reasonably, the kid eventually gets out scot free, and ultimately the Betty uh, gets what she gets at the end of all of this. So that's how this story just kind of eventually concludes with these interesting stories. You have Betty who kind of gets what she wants in the end, which is a love story, and but ends up still burning for it in the end in the oven. So this was an interesting review. This was an interesting thing to do. Uh, Ultimately, I've talked about this in some portions in things before, but now I can cementingly do a real true review about it and have it be its own thing, which more than likely maybe people will care about, or maybe people will just like, what is this? What the heck is this? What is he talking about? This is nonsense. What a weird movie that he chose here. But I thought it was like the most weirdest thing that you've ever seen in your life. And I think that's the best part about it is this story of this killer cat was just the honest thing I've ever seen. So I needed to go back to it and talk about it and watch it again and just be like, yeah, this movie is so goofy, but it's something that I needed to see again to just have a good laugh because I think that's what this movie really does at some points. You laugh at it, you enjoy it, you feel good while watching it, for me, honestly. But at the end of the day, I think that's all I want to say about this. I'm going to get out of here. Bye, everybody. Bye, everybody.